Hello, my name is Emma, and I've been a flight attendant for 7 years. I've seen everything from mid-air proposals to medical emergencies, but nothing prepared me for what happened on Flight 471. It started as an ordinary night shift, the kind where the passengers are quiet, the air feels still, and the crew moves through the aisles like clockwork. The kind of flight where nothing should feel wrong. But it did. From the moment we took off from Singapore, something about that night didn't sit right with me. The aircraft hummed its usual steady rhythm as we leveled off above the clouds. I remember walking down the aisle after meal service, checking seat belts, and making sure everyone had settled in for the long haul to Sydney. Most passengers were already half asleep, screens dimmed, windows shut. The cabin had that faint, recycled smell of coffee, perfume, and air conditioning, a mix you learn to stop noticing after a while. That's when I saw him. Seat 19 amperes, window side, mid-cabin. I could have sworn that row was empty earlier, but maybe I'd missed him in the rush. He was dressed neatly, an older man, maybe mid-50s, wearing a gray suit and a tie loosened at the neck. Nothing remarkable about him at all, and yet something about his stillness drew my attention. He wasn't watching a movie, or reading, or sleeping. He just sat there, hands clasped, eyes fixed out the window into the pitch-black sky. I slowed my pace as I walked past him, partly out of habit, partly curiosity. He noticed and turned his head toward me. His expression was calm, polite, but there was something in his eyes, an awareness that made me feel like he was studying me rather than just looking. I smiled, the kind of professional, neutral smile we're trained to give, and asked softly, "Everything all right, sir?" He nodded once. "Yes, thank you." His voice was low and clear, steady in a way that felt out of place in that sleepy cabin. Then he said something that, at the time, made no sense at all. "You might want to hold tight," just like that. Not a joke, not playful, not said with a hint of irony. A quiet warning, calm and certain. I blinked, caught off guard. "Sorry?" I asked. But before I could get another word out, the aircraft jolted. A sudden drop, sharp enough to send my stomach lurching into my throat. Someone screamed behind me. The beverage cart, which we'd secured just moments before, rattled violently against its latch. The cabin lights flickered. Then it hit. The kind of turbulence that throws even experienced crews off balance. I grabbed the nearest seat back, instinctively bracing myself as the plane lurched up and down in violent jerks. Overhead bins rattled, oxygen masks swayed, and the low drone of the engines turned into a shuddering roar. I heard the captain's voice over the intercom, calm but urgent. "Cabin crew, take your seats immediately." But I couldn't move. The aisle was chaos. I crouched low, gripping the armrest nearest to me, praying it would end. Through the shaking, I glanced at seat 19 amperes. The man hadn't moved. Not a twitch. He sat there, eyes forward, completely still, as if the turbulence didn't exist. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The plane steadied, the lights flickered back to full brightness, and the sound of collective breathing filled the cabin. A baby cried. Someone clapped nervously, the way passengers do when they don't know what else to do. My knees were trembling as I pushed myself up, doing a quick mental check. No injuries, no loose items. When I turned back toward 19 amperes, I expected him to say something, maybe a calm remark, maybe nothing at all. But the seat was empty. I frowned, thinking maybe he'd gone to the lavatory, though it didn't make sense. The seatbelt sign was still on, and no one had passed me in the aisle. I looked closer. His blanket was folded neatly, tucked at the edges, and the seatbelt lay flat, buckled across the cushion. There was no water bottle, no book, no sign anyone had been there at all. "Excuse me," I whispered to a woman in 19C who was still clutching her armrest. "Wasn't there a man sitting next to you just now?" She looked confused, then shook her head. "No, I was alone the whole time. No one was sitting there." That made no sense. I had looked right at him. I had spoken to him. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. My mind kept circling back to that moment, the calm in his eyes, the tone of his voice, the exact words he'd said. "You might want to hold tight." He hadn't guessed, hadn't warned in fear. It was as though he knew exactly what was about to happen. After landing in Sydney, while passengers disembarked, I slipped into the empty cabin for one last walkthrough. It's part of the procedure, making sure nothing's left behind. The seatbelts hung loose, the overhead bins clicked open and shut as I checked them. When I reached row 19, I stopped. 19 amperes looked just as it had mid-flight, perfectly arranged. The window shade is halfway up. And yet, the faintest impression of pressure remained on the seat cushion, as if someone had been sitting there only minutes before. For a long time, I stood there, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd imagined him. Maybe fatigue had played tricks on me. But fatigue doesn't make you hear a voice. It doesn't make someone vanish. As I finally left the plane, I turned back one last time. The cabin lights had dimmed to standby mode, casting long shadows across the rows. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing near the window. Same gray suit, same stillness. But when I blinked, the seat was empty again. I didn't tell anyone that night. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding unhinged. But the memory of his voice followed me long after that flight. Calm, certain, as if spoken from somewhere beyond understanding. You might want to hold tight. And I did. But not just during turbulence. After that night, I found myself gripping the armrest every time I flew, every time the plane hit even the smallest bump. Because somewhere deep down, part of me still hears that voice. And I know it wasn't my imagination. That man, whoever, whatever he was, knew something the rest of us didn't. When the aircraft finally leveled out, the cabin was filled with a strange, collective silence. The kind that lingers right after fear has passed but before relief can settle in. Passengers glanced around, their faces pale and uncertain, as if confirming with one another that what had just happened was real. I went through the motions, checking overhead bins, offering soft smiles, and reassuring words, but my mind wasn't on the job. It was fixed on one thing: the man in seat 19 amperes. I walked straight toward the window row, weaving between the aisles as people adjusted their blankets and seatbelts. Every part of me expected to find him sitting there, calm as ever, maybe even offering that same quiet nod he'd given me before the turbulence started. But when I reached the seat, my chest tightened. He was gone. The seatbelt lay across the cushion, neatly fastened. The kind of tidy setup we'd usually do before boarding, not something a passenger would leave after a storm like that. The blanket was still folded at a perfect angle, not a single crease out of place. No headphones, no phone, no glass of water. It was as if no one had been there to begin with. For a second, I stood frozen, staring at the empty seat. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe he'd gone to the lavatory, though it didn't explain how he'd done that while the seatbelt sign was on. I turned to the woman sitting in 19C again, a middle-aged lady with reading glasses dangling around her neck. She looked rattled, like most passengers, but alert enough to remember. "Ma'am," I said gently, crouching beside her. "Do you remember the gentleman sitting here earlier? About my height, gray suit, older?" She frowned, clearly confused. There wasn't anyone there. That seat's been empty since we took off. My stomach dropped. I forced a smile, thanked her, and stood up. Maybe she hadn't noticed him. Maybe he'd been quiet enough to go unseen. But the memory of his eyes, the certainty in his voice, it wasn't something I could have imagined. I moved on, checking the nearby rows. "Excuse me," I asked a younger man across the aisle. "Do you recall anyone sitting in 19 amperes before the turbulence?" He shook his head. "No, I don't think so. I was watching a movie. That row looked empty the whole time." By now, my pulse had started to race. I could hear the faint hum of the engines again, steady and calm, but inside me, everything was spinning. I turned toward the galley where two of my colleagues, Fiona and Matteo, were securing loose items that had spilled during the shake. Fiona glanced up and smiled shakily. "You all right, Em?" That one was rough. "Yeah," I said, still trying to sound normal. "Did either of you serve the man in 19 amperes before meal service?" Matteo looked puzzled. "Which one? The one in the gray suit, window seat, middle cabin?" I pressed. He shook his head. "There wasn't anyone there, Emma. 19 amperes empty. Always has been. I did that section myself before takeoff." My mouth went dry. I wanted to argue, to tell him he must have missed him, but the confidence in his tone stopped me. Fiona tilted her head, concern settling in her eyes. "Maybe you're just tired," she said softly. "You've been on 4 flights this week." I nodded automatically, pretending that it made sense. But in my gut, I knew what I saw. The man was real. He had spoken to me. The rest of the flight felt slower, heavier. Every time I walked past 19 amperes, I felt that same chill rise my spine. The seat sat there quietly, untouched, mocking me with its perfect neatness. I couldn't focus on the passengers anymore. Every movement in my periphery made me glance back toward that row, half expecting him to be there again, sitting as calmly as before. When the captain announced our descent into Sydney, I forced myself to breathe, to anchor back into routine. I helped secure the cabin, checked the aisles, and gave the practiced smile to passengers waking from their uneasy naps. But when I passed 19 amperes one last time before landing, something made me stop. There was a faint indentation on the seat cushion, like someone had been sitting there not long ago. It wasn't deep, but it was visible enough to make my skin crawl. I brushed my hand over it, and the fabric was warm. Not body warm, but not cold either, somewhere in between, as if it remembered him. The wheels hit the runway a few minutes later. The usual shuffle of passengers began, seatbelts clicking, phones buzzing back to life, bags being yanked from overhead bins. I stood near the galley door, pretending to check paperwork, but my mind was elsewhere. As passengers exited, I kept my eyes open for him. The gray suit, the calm eyes. Maybe he'd just moved seats. Maybe he'd show up now, walking out like nothing happened. But row after row emptied, and I never saw him again. When the last person stepped off, I walked the cabin one final time. It was quiet now, the kind of stillness that feels almost sacred. The sunlight through the windows painted faint golden lines across the seats. And there it was, 19 amperes, perfectly empty. I touched the headrest, then the folded blanket, as if doing so might explain it, but nothing about it made sense. For a second, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked pale, tired, like someone who'd just imagined the whole thing. I tried to convince myself I had, but then I remembered his words again, exactly as he said them, steady, precise, and just before the world went mad. You might want to hold tight. There was no way I'd imagined that. The words still echoed in my ears long after we closed the cabin doors. After landing, everything moved into procedure mode. Passengers filed out, dragging bags, stretching their legs, talking about the turbulence in half-joking tones like it had been some kind of roller coaster. I smiled and nodded in the right places, but my head was somewhere else. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in 19 amperes. When the last passenger left, I went back down the aisle, making sure every seat pocket was empty and no one had forgotten anything. I paused by 19 amperes again. The blanket still lay perfectly folded, the seatbelt still buckled across the cushion. No crumbs, no headset, no trace of a person. I touched the armrest, and it was warm, not like body heat, more like the kind of warmth metal keeps for a little while, after someone's been resting there. I pulled my hand away and told myself it was nothing. Just the cabin lights, or maybe the air vents. After we disembarked, I caught up with the chief purser, Lisa, in the crew office near the gate. She was reviewing reports for the turbulence incident, the kind we always file after rough flights. I waited until she finished typing before I said quietly, "Lisa, I need to ask you something strange." She raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" "About a passenger," I said. "Seat 19 amperes. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. "All right," she said carefully. "What about him?" "There was a man there before the turbulence hit," I explained. "Older, gray suit, short hair. He told me to hold tight right before the plane started shaking." Lisa blinked slowly. "Okay, and?" "When the turbulence stopped, he was gone, completely gone. The seat was empty, and no one else seems to remember seeing him." She stared at me for a few seconds, the way someone looks when they're trying to decide if you're joking or losing it. Then she turned to her screen, typing a few keys. "Let's check," she said. "Passenger manifest will clear this up." I stood behind her as she scrolled through the list. Flight 471, full load, 268 passengers, all accounted for. She went down to row 19. My pulse picked up as her cursor hovered over seat 19 amperes. It was blank. "No show?" Lisa said. "Booked, but never boarded." My stomach dropped. "That can't be right." "It happens," she said, shrugging. "People cancel last minute or miss their connection. Maybe that's what happened here." I shook my head. "No, I spoke to him, Lisa. He was sitting there. I heard him." She sighed softly, a mix of concern and fatigue. "You've been working too many long hauls. These night flights mess with your head. You probably saw someone sitting in 19B or 19C and misremembered." "I didn't," I said too quickly. He was right there, window seat. Lisa gave me a measured look. All right, let's check the boarding footage. That'll settle it. We walked together to the operations office, where security footage from the boarding gate was still logged. The technician on duty replayed the video, time-stamped from the final boarding call up until the doors closed. Passenger after passenger filed in, some smiling, some sleepy, some dragging duty-free bags. We both leaned closer as the sequence played, watching for anyone in a gray suit. Nothing. No man matching his description. No Onone is stopping at seat 19 amperes. The row was visible for a few seconds in the background of the cabin camera, empty from takeoff to landing. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't even realize I'd taken a step back until Lisa looked at me and said quietly, "You see it too, right? No one sat there." I nodded, my throat dry. Lisa rubbed her forehead. "Okay, let's just keep this between us for now, all right? You're shaken up. Maybe it was stress or you mixed up the seats. It's been a long shift." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't find the words. The evidence was right in front of me. There was no man, no record of him boarding, no image of him on the cameras. And yet, I could still hear his voice. Calm, deliberate, unhurried. You might want to hold tight. That night, after I got back to my hotel, I opened the flight log on my phone. I found the seat map and looked at it again. 19 amperes. The name listed there was Passenger No-Show. I stared at it for a long time before locking the screen and setting the phone down. I didn't sleep. The next day, when we met for debrief, Lisa didn't mention it. Neither did I. But as we waited for the shuttle to the airport, she turned to me and said quietly, "You know what's strange? I checked the manifest archive. That same seat number, 19 amperes, has been listed as a no-show 3 flights in a row." I didn't reply. I just looked out the window of the shuttle as the city passed by, thinking about the man who shouldn't have been there, who somehow was. The one who'd warned me seconds before everything went wrong, then disappeared like he was never part of the world to begin with. And the more I thought about it, the more one question kept looping in my head, over and over. If he never boarded, where did he speak from? A week later, I was back home in my small apartment, trying to pretend that life had gone back to normal. It hadn't. I was restless, distracted, checking the news for anything, any report that might explain what had happened on Flight 471. Nothing. The airline had logged the turbulence as severe but contained. The passengers had all been accounted for. Everything was fine, officially. Except it wasn't. I hadn't told anyone else about the man in 19 amperes. Not my friends, not my family. I could already hear how it would sound out loud. A ghost passenger told me to hold tight before turbulence. People would think I'd lost it, but the image of his face stayed with me. Calm, detached, like someone watching a movie they'd already seen before. Then, late one evening, I got an email from someone named Ravi Patel, an airline safety investigator who'd been assigned to review the flight's turbulence data. His message was brief and oddly formal. "Miss Roberts, during the post-incident review, we noticed an anomaly on the cockpit voice recorder. Could you please come by the operations center tomorrow for a quick discussion?" I didn't know why a flight attendant would need to be involved in that kind of review, but curiosity got the better of me. The next day, I met him in a small, sterile office tucked behind the operations floor. Fluorescent lights, folders stacked in perfect rows, the faint hum of air conditioning. He was polite but serious, the kind of man who'd probably spent years analyzing data that never made sense until it did. He offered me a seat and said, "You were one of the reporting crew members for Flight 471, correct?" "Yes," I said. He nodded and pulled out a small recorder. We reviewed the cockpit audio leading up to the turbulence event. Something unusual came up. We're not sure what to make of it. He pressed play. The recording began with the usual hum of the engines, the clink of cups in the galley, the faint murmur of passenger chatter. Then the captain's voice. Routine communications, altitude readings, turbulence alerts. Everything sounded normal. But then, about 8 seconds before the first jolt hit, there was a whisper. So faint you almost missed it. A man's voice, clear but quiet, saying one word. "Now." My stomach turned. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until Ravi looked at me. "You hear it?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Yes." He leaned back in his chair. "We thought it might be a mechanical artifact, static, or cross-channel interference, but it doesn't match the frequencies of the cockpit mics. It's separate, almost like it came from the cabin. He paused before adding, "You were serving in the midsection at that exact time, weren't you?" I nodded again, my mouth dry. "Yes, row 19. He glanced at his notes. "You mentioned in your report that you spoke to a man right before the turbulence began. Can you tell me exactly what he said?" I hesitated. Saying it out loud suddenly felt heavier. He told me to hold tight, and then it started. Ravi exhaled slowly and switched off the recorder. "That's what I thought." "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked down at the folder in front of him, then back at me. "There's something else. We analyzed the decibel levels of that whisper. It's spatially distant, not from the cockpit area. The waveform suggests it came from the middle cabin, about the same area as seat 19 amperes. The room felt smaller suddenly. "That seat was empty," I said. "It's been empty every time." I checked. The passenger never boarded. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "We confirmed that, but the voice, wherever it came from, it's recorded clearly enough to rule out interference." Silence stretched between us. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above us. "So, what are you saying?" I asked. He hesitated, then said quietly, "We don't know. But there's one more thing. Flight 471 had an almost identical turbulence incident 10 years ago. Same route, same time of year. And according to the report, a man in 19 amperes suffered a fatal heart attack moments before the turbulence struck. The crew described him as wearing a gray suit. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're serious?" He nodded. "We keep records of all fatal in-flight incidents. That one stood out because of the timing. It happened seconds before the turbulence, almost to the second. And here's the odd part. The turbulence that followed was severe enough to trigger a safety review, just like this one." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air like static. When I finally found my voice, it came out quietly. "You think it was him?" Ravi didn't answer. He just closed the folder and said, "We're not supposed to speculate." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "But whatever it was, it saved you." I left the office in a daze. Outside, the airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and laughter echoing down the halls. Life moved on as if none of it mattered. But as I stood near the window overlooking the runway, watching another plane lift into the clouds, I couldn't shake the thought. That voice, that word, the whisper that wasn't supposed to exist. Now, it hadn't been a warning to me, or to the pilots. It felt like something else. Like a signal, a trigger. And for the first time since that flight, I realized something terrifying. Maybe he hadn't been trying to protect us at all. Maybe he'd just been waiting. I didn't plan to work Flight 471 again. After that incident, I started swapping rosters whenever I saw it listed. But the airline runs on routine, and routines have a way of catching up to you. 2 months later, when I checked my schedule, there it was. Singapore to Sydney, Flight 471. My chest tightened the moment I saw it. I thought about trading shifts, but part of me needed closure. I couldn't keep running from one strange night forever. Maybe it really was fatigue. Maybe my mind had made more of it than it was. But deep down, I knew what I saw, and more importantly, what I heard. When I boarded that night, everything felt eerily familiar. Same aircraft type, same route, same subtle scent of cabin air that never changes, no matter where you go. Even the lighting looked the same. Soft and golden, dimmed just enough to make the cabin feel like it was caught between night and morning. Before passengers boarded, I walked down the aisle for my pre-flight check. When I reached row 19, my steps slowed. Seat 19 amperes was blocked. No headrest cover, no pillow, no seatbelt ready for use. Just a laminated card resting on the cushion that read, "Seat out of service." It wasn't uncommon. Sometimes seats were deactivated for maintenance or weight distribution. Still, it didn't look damaged. It looked perfectly normal, except for the subtle flicker of the reading light above it. Engineering couldn't fix the wiring. "My lead, Fiona," said from behind me. "That light keeps turning itself on during turbulence." They finally gave up and blocked the seat. I stared at the faint glow. "During turbulence? Yeah, weird, right? Only then. Every other time, it works fine." I nodded, pretending it didn't bother me. But inside, I felt that slow crawl of unease I'd tried so hard to forget. Once passengers boarded, I found myself glancing toward that row more than I should have. A few travelers gave me curious looks as they passed it. One older man even joked, "What's wrong with that seat? Haunted or something?" I forced a polite laugh. "Just a technical issue." But when the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, I caught something I couldn't explain. The seatbelt light above 19 amperes flickered twice, on, off, on, while every other indicator stayed steady. I told myself it was a coincidence, faulty wiring, but the pattern was too deliberate, like someone had reached up and tapped it. The flight itself was uneventful for the first few hours. Smooth air, calm passengers, and a quiet crew. But as we crossed the Timor Sea, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we may encounter some light turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." My breath caught. The same words as before. I looked down the aisle. Everything was still. No movement, no sound except the low hum of the engines. My gaze went, unwillingly, to 19 amperes. The seat light was glowing again, faint and steady this time. I don't know why I did it, but I started walking toward it, slowly, quietly, as if I made a sound. I'd break whatever fragile calm the cabin still had. When I reached the row, I stopped beside the seat and stared at the empty cushion. The air felt colder there. Not in a dramatic, supernatural way, just unnaturally still, like the circulation vents had stopped working. I whispered, barely loud enough to hear myself, "Are you here again?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, somewhere deep within the aircraft's structure, I felt a faint shudder, the kind that comes a few seconds before turbulence starts. And in that exact instant, the seatbelt light above 19 amperes blinked 3 times. The plane jolted hard. Passengers gasped. Carts rattled. I grabbed the nearest armrest and braced. The turbulence wasn't as violent as last time, but it was sudden, too sudden to have been predicted. I heard the familiar creak of the fuselage under pressure and the muffled sound of a prayer whispered from a few rows back. When the shaking stopped, I looked back at the seat. The reading light was off now, but the seatbelt sign above it was still lit, steady and bright. I didn't move for a long time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I could almost hear his voice again, low and calm. "You might want to hold tight." After we landed in Sydney, the passengers disembarked in the usual slow, tired shuffle. I waited until the cabin was empty, then walked back to row 19. The seat was just as I'd left it, empty, untouched, cold. But this time, something small caught my eye. Tucked between the seat cushion and the wall was a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, like it had been there for years. I hesitated before picking it up. It was a passenger comment card, the kind we used to hand out before everything went digital. In neat, slanted handwriting, one line was filled in under additional comments. It said, "She listened." No signature. I stood there, the card trembling slightly in my hand. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe an old card, maybe a prank, maybe someone trying to get a reaction. But deep down, I knew. It was him, the man in 19 amperes, the one who shouldn't have existed, the one who'd warned me. I left the card where I found it, tucking it back under the seat. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained. Maybe some passengers never really leave. Before I exited the plane, I turned back for one last look. The cabin lights were dimmed now, shadows stretching across the rows, and in that quiet, fleeting second before the doors closed, I could have sworn I saw a faint reflection in the window of 19 amperes, a man in a gray suit, looking out into the dark, the corners of his mouth just barely curved into a calm, knowing smile. Then the light above the seat blinked once, and went out. For weeks after that last flight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had stayed with me. I told myself I'd let it go, that I'd leave whatever happened on Flight 471 behind, but truthfully, it never left me. Every time I stepped onto a plane, every time I walked past row 19, I felt that quiet presence again. Not threatening, not menacing, just there, watching, waiting. The airline quietly retired that aircraft a few months later. Routine maintenance rotation, they called it, but I overheard one of the engineers mention something odd. The cabin lights over 19 amperes kept malfunctioning, even when the system was replaced entirely. The panel would flicker back on every time turbulence hit, even during ground tests. They couldn't explain it. No one could. Eventually, I transferred to a new route, one that never crossed that patch of sky between Singapore and Sydney. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but I still think about him, the man in the gray suit, the one who looked right at me with that steady calm, as if he knew the future was only seconds away. Sometimes, I wonder what he was warning me of. Was it just the turbulence, or something bigger, something beyond what we could see? The word now still echoes in my head. The way he said, "Hold tight," not out of fear, but almost like an instruction, like he knew I'd need to remember it. I never saw him again, but every so often, when I'm flying through rough air, I'll glance down the aisle and feel that same stillness settle in the cabin. And when the plane trembles, just for a second, I whisper the words back to him under my breath. "All right," I say quietly, "I'm holding tight," and somewhere deep inside, it feels like he hears me.